moving today into another country, Sri Lanka, and looking at a poem from there, July 1983, by Anne Ranasinghe. Sri Lanka, some of you may know, attained independence soon after we did, India did, in 1948 to be precise. So in Sri Lanka, we do have poems in the English language. We also have poems in Sinhala and Tamil. The British English poems naturally would be different from the Sri Lankan English poems, as I've been saying again and again. Somewhere in the 1930s, I believe, Sri Lankans began writing in English, and then there was a spurt of poems on nationalism. Some of us might ask, why English? And I remember the words of our Indian poet, Nissim Ezekiel, I think, who said, I didn't choose English, English chose me. The language I speak becomes mine, says another Sri Lankan writer, Yasmin Gunaratne. Anne Ranasinghe, the Sri Lankan poet, 1925 to 2016. We must know something about her in order to be able to appreciate this poem. She was actually born in Germany, but they fled to England during the Nazis. Naturally, being a Jew, she couldn't stay on in Germany. Later, she married a Sri Lankan professor and moved to live in Sri Lanka. In 1956, she became a Sri Lankan citizen. Her first collection was called And the Sun That Sucks the Earth to Dry. What a telling title for a collection of poems. Recurrent themes are the Holocaust, alienation, minority persecution, and such like. She has published 10 books, 10 collections of poems, and many of them have been translated into 7 languages of the world. July 1983. For those of us who are aware of the history of Sri Lanka, it may not come as a surprise. The title of the poem talks about 24th July 1983, when anti-Tamil rioting began. I'm not going to talk about the political or the historical context because there are many Sri Lankans who think of it as a state-sponsored program. But let's look at the poem. I used to wonder about the Nazi killers and those who stood and watched the killing. I've already told you about her, how she fled from Nazi persecution. And she now is in Sri Lanka and she's watching a similar kind of horror, of violence, of torture, of inhumanity against humans. I used to wonder about the Nazi killers, she says. And what did people do? Did they stand and watch? Does the memory of so many pleading eyes stab like lightning through their days and years? Those who are responsible for this violence, do they feel guilty about it? She wonders. And do the voices of orphan children weeping forlornly before dying haunt their nights? I'm not going to talk about Nazi Germany. I'm not going to talk about the horrors of the Holocaust to you, my dear friends. But for this German who fled the horrors of the Holocaust, I think all those memories of the gas chambers are coming back to haunt her. And she's wondering whether those who were responsible for that are haunted by those voices, by those eyes, by those screams, and what have you. Are there sleepless nights for them? Has the agony and anguish and the blood and terror and pain carved a trail in their brain, screaming? And what does it scream? I'm guilty. Never again does it happen, she wonders. And now she's coming to the present in Sri Lanka. 40 years later, Once more there is burning, the night sky bloodied, violent and abused. And I, though related only by marriage, feel myself both victim and accused. I have to remind you, my dear listeners, friends, that we are talking about a civil war. And probably a civil war is the worst kind of war, because here it is brother against brother. And therefore, though she's sure she was a victim in Nazi Germany, here she's not sure whether she's a victim or she's the accused, because we are thinking of the Sinhala versus the Tamil here. Black gutted timber splits, shards and ashes blowing in the wind, nothing remains. Everything is destroyed. And everything here is not only the material things of life, but I think humanity is dead. Brotherhood is dead. Love, patriotism, all of that is dead. And therefore she says, the last verse, flinch at the thinnest curtain of smoke, shrink from the merest thought of fire. Any fire is frightening, because I've seen so much of destruction caused by fire, she says. The poem is a short poem, not very regular rhyme scheme, not even stanza form, because it begins with a 2-line stanza, moves on into 3-line stanzas. Obviously, hardly any rhyme scheme. When it is a cry from the heart, I guess all this gets tossed out of the window. But what comes alive is the metaphor that she's able to use. She's talking about a trail in the brain. I want you to use your imagination. All the bloodshed that she's seen in the ethnic violence in Sri Lanka, she imagines, carves a trail of blood in her brain. So it becomes a metaphor for the violence outside. Another figure of speech that she uses is personification. She talks about the night sky bloodied. Okay, you know what personification is? When we give human qualities, emotions, feelings to inanimate objects. And therefore, you have the night sky bloodied. Not too many other figures of speech, because what is most important here is the thematic concern, is the cry for humanity, which seems to be dead and gone. One would have thought that ethnic violence would have ended after the Second World War. But sadly, that has not happened. Poems like July 1983 help develop empathy for victims of such violence. Nothing seems to have changed even half a century later. Poems in volumes like Holocaust poetry should be read to develop sympathy and a humane viewpoint.